Hello and welcome to another episode of Arcade Exclusives, where we take a look at some of the arcade only games for a certain company. This time it's Nintendo. Despite being almost 40 years older than sliced bread, not a joke, Nintendo didn't start making video games until much later. In fact, they only released arcade games between 1978 and 1985, and very few at that. All but one of their arcade games were made during a 4-year period between 78 and 81, so Nintendo's foray into the arcade scene was short-lived indeed. Today I'll have a look at 6 of their arcade exclusive games, with the help of my friends Alex from Nintendo Arcade and Lee from Pug Hoof Gaming. A notable exclusion is Sky Skipper, but I have special plans for covering that in case you are wondering why it's absent from the video. Of course, their most well-known arcade game is 1981's Donkey Kong, but that received myriad home ports. So let's take a look at some of Nintendo's games that never left the arcades. The first game we'll look at is 1979's Space Fever, which was Nintendo's third arcade video game. Developed by Nintendo R&D 1 and most likely programmed by Ikegami, this was released in colour and monochrome versions and was primarily a cocktail, aka a tabletop cab, although Sega did produce an upright cabinet. Only one of these rare upright cabs is known to exist today. As with all of Nintendo's earliest arcade games, Space Fever was a clone. As you can see, it was clearly designed to mimic Taito's Space Invaders. Just like Space Invaders, in Space Fever the aim is to shoot rows of attacking aliens while avoiding the projectiles that they drop. When a row reaches the edge of the screen, they all drop down a level closer to the player's ship. The closer they get, the faster the aliens will move, and the more frequently they'll drop projectiles. UFOs also travel across the top of the screen, which can be shot for bonus points. Unlike Space Invaders, this will shrink in size when shot and move faster, and can subsequently be shot again for extra points. Despite Space Fever's apparent similarities with Space Invaders, there are some other differences too. There are essentially 6 game modes, 3 for single player and 3 for 2 player. One pair works exactly as Space Invaders does, and the other 2 have different enemy movements and behaviours. Although Space Fever was far from being an original concept, it did play a significant part in Nintendo's arcade history. Next on our list is 1979's Sheriff, which is by far my favourite. Who better to tell you all about this game than one of the few people to own an original Sheriff arcade cabinet, so let me hand you over to my friend Alex from Nintendo Arcade.
Hi, I'm Alex from Nintendo Arcade and this is my Sheriff upright arcade machine. This game was brought out by Nintendo in 1979 and is an extremely rare cabinet to find. There's only 4 known Sheriff uprights in the world. There's one in Austria, there's one in an arcade in Japan, there's one right here in this room, and one turned up a few years ago on Yahoo auctions in bits really. So it's an extremely rare game. Now whether there wasn't that many made or whether loads have been destroyed, we'll never know, but the time that I've been in this hobby, only 4 have popped up. So it's an extremely rare cabinet, although Nintendo did make a cocktail version of this game and they did make a trimline version of this game, which actually has been in my collection. As you can see, the artwork on this cabinet is absolutely beautiful, and all of these drawings were done by Shigeru Miyamoto. We all know Shigeru Miyamoto for Mario and Zelda. Well, this was one of the first games he put his stamp on, so it's an extremely special game. From a history point of view, this is probably one of the first games he put his artwork to, and we know that because we've had confirmation from Nintendo Japan. What also makes this game unique, it's got very unique control system here. It's like a very early twin stick shooter. So you've got this joystick here that controls the character, Jack, and this, what I call a gas knob, controls your arm in 8-way directions and push down to fire. So it's a very difficult game to emulate. You can play it on main, but obviously you need these control systems to play it. So yeah, and another unique thing about this cabinet, it's got a half mirror, so the monitor is actually in the bottom half of the cabinet, and what you're seeing is a reflection of the gameplay through the bezel. It's an absolutely beautiful cabinet. The only other game that was built in this particular cabinet was Space Launcher, but we've never seen a Space Launcher in existence. So this is an extremely rare cabinet, and it's a great game. So it's a very early sandbox game, really. You've got Jack, the character that you play, in the middle of the screen, trying to defeat the gangs or the bandidos that are walking around the side of the screen. And slowly, as they deplete, they get faster and they move into the sandbox, turn yellow, where you can get double points. You can also shoot the condor for an extra 500 points that goes across the top, very similar to Space Invaders. So it's a fantastic game, and this game was brought out in America by Exidy, and it was called Bandido. So Nintendo let other companies distribute their games before Nintendo of America was established. So in America you had Exidy distributing this game as Bandido, and this cabinet, as you can see, looks completely different, but the game plays exactly the same. In the UK, a company called Bellfruit distributed this game, which is probably the one I played back on the day. Again, it looks completely different. It's got a bezel that's in two halves. And also Sega. Yes, Sega distributed a lot of Nintendo games, and they make their own cabinet for Sheriff as well. And I've actually seen this in collectors' hands, and it's absolutely stunning. So yeah, a very unusual game. It's got a bit of a legacy as well. So if you ever played Super Smash Brothers and you get the assist trophy, Jack, you'll recognise that. That is actually from this game. Also, if you play WarioWare on the Game Boy Advance, you actually get to play Sheriff. And also, if you own a Vectrex, you can get a copy of Frontier, which plays very similar to Sheriff and is a fantastic game, well worth playing. So yeah, that's it really. This is the cabinet. Really proud to have this in my collection. So it's been in my collection a long time. I actually acquired this from Luxembourg, drove all the way over there to pick it up and all the way back, and it will never go out of my collection because it means so much to me playing this back in the day as a kid. So that's it, guys. And my Nintendo Sheriff. Thanks for watching.
HeliFire came out in 1980, and as with Space Fever and Sheriff, it was developed by Nintendo R&D 1 and thought to have been programmed by Ikegami. It came in both cocktail and upright cabs, but as with many of these Nintendo arcade games, they're very rare. This is similar in principle to Space Fever in that you're shooting enemies overhead, but the twist is that the enemies are scrolling horizontally across the screen, including enemies below the water that are at your level. You control a submarine, attacking waves of passing helicopters, hence the name. The choppers come in waves of any of 4 colours, with each colour signifying a different speed, and they drop either white bombs, which resemble a primitive drawing of an upside down penis, or yellow depth charges. As well as dealing with these being dropped on you, you have to be mindful of what's going on in the water. All manner of things to avoid scroll across the screen, including enemy boats, torpedoes and even marine wildlife, so there's a lot to keep your eye on. This creates a scrolling Space Invaders on steroids, so you'll need your wits about you to succeed. A level contains 30 helicopters divided into 3 sets of 10. The aim is to take them out within a set time, otherwise they become more deadly. After each of these levels, the water level rises, which makes things harder for 2 reasons. Not only will your sub be closer to the attacking helicopters overhead, but there will also be more water in which to encounter hazards. There's no music, and as you'd expect, the sound effects are pretty primitive and actually quite annoying, but gameplay wise HeliFire is great if you like a challenge. Attacking the helicopters by timing your missiles just right is tricky enough without having to dodge what's going on in the water, so this is certainly no walk in the park even for a seasoned arcade gamer. An NES and Famicom port of HeliFire was planned but didn't happen, so it remained an arcade exclusive, although a homebrew port for the ColecoVision was released around 6 years ago.
In the wake of Taito's seminal Space Invaders, a torrent of single-screen shooters flooded Japanese arcades as every corporation capable of putting out an arcade cabinet did just that, hoping to get a taste of that sweet, sweet yen. And as a toy company relatively new to the realm of arcade development, Nintendo themselves had already created several derivative works of the genre by the time 1979's Radarscope was released in Japanese arcades that December. While this simple shooter's legacy relates more to its impacts upon Nintendo's fortunes rather than on the minds of the game's playing public, at least in terms of Western players, there is something to be said about how Radarscope tries to set itself apart from Space Invaders and its myriad of Me Too's, even if at first glance it doesn't always seem that way. The play area is mostly similar to its peers, a single field filled with enemy sprites at the top, 48 of them in fact, and the player's attacking craft at the bottom, which is limited to moving along the X-axis. Upon playing the game for yourself, you start to realise that there is a slight perspective effect, as the far left and right edges of the horizontal axis are ever so slightly skewed, enough to affect your ability to judge your intended placement of shots. On paper, it's a neat effect to give the impression that you're fighting on a larger battlefield, but in practice it sort of adds an extra layer of difficulty. While the horde of pixelated aliens slowly swarm down the screen in gradual steps in a similar style to Namco's Galaxian, smaller numbers will break away and swoop down towards the player, and this is the basis of Radarscope's main scoring mechanics. In order to hit those higher scores, players are given more points for killing enemies that are close to the very bottom of the screen, which is not an easy task, especially as they're able to pop off a few shots of their own, which are pretty difficult to avoid. And if that wasn't enough to contend with, you're also there to defend your base. You have a damage meter at the bottom, which isn't related to your fragile ship that can be destroyed with one hit. Nope, that meter is for your unseen space station, which the enemy will attack with some nasty looking bombs that you must also destroy before they reach the bottom of the screen. As the damage meter takes more hits, the slower the firing rate of your ship's laser, further adding to the game's difficulty. As you can imagine, the destruction of all 48 enemy sprites hails the end of that level and immediate transportation to the next battle with another 48 enemies. As is the case for this era of arcade gaming, it's all pretty simple stuff, but as you may well know, Radarscope's eventual fate would lead to much greater things. Fast forward a few months to 1980, Nintendo had just established an American branch of the company in New York that year to help distribute and market their growing range of arcade and electronic products to a Western audience. Owing to the Japanese success of Radarscope, as the second biggest moneymaker behind Namco's Pac-Man, that game was earmarked to be Nintendo's big hope for success in their maiden voyage into the international market. Thousands of units were shipped to America for potential distribution to arcade owners, but ultimately their new market was just not impressed, causing a large number of units remaining unsold and taking up costly warehouse space. The wrong decision could have scuppered Nintendo's plans for world domination before they'd even began, but somehow Nintendo took this bad fortune and turned it into success, a feat they would perform many times in the future. One of Radarscope's team members, a young artist by the name of Shigeru Miyamoto, was given direct orders by Nintendo of Japan's president, Hiroshi Yamauchi, to design a game that could be used to convert existing Radarscope cabinets to something a bit more palatable to American audiences. He came up with a single-screen platformer by the name of Donkey Kong, and of course the rest is history. Of the 3,000 or so Radarscope cabinets in storage, about 2,000 were converted to Donkey Kong, making those unchanged cabinets a real rarity and also cementing Radarscope's reputation as a failure. Did it deserve to have that label? Certainly not. It is an interesting take on the template left by Space Invaders, offering a chance for players to nail down high levels of skill for greater rewards. Sadly, the numbers just didn't justify a port to home consoles, as would happen with Donkey Kong, first as a port to various early consoles and home computers, before finding its way onto Nintendo's own home console and electronic game offerings.
Space Firebird came out in 1980 and, as with all of the first 5 games on this list, it was developed by Nintendo R&D 1 with rumoured Ikegami involvement. This was the third game that Miyamoto worked on as a designer after the previous year's Sheriff and Radarscope. Another spin on the fixed vertical shooter genre, Space Firebird sees you control a ship at the bottom of the screen which can move horizontally. This plays more like Galaxian than Space Invaders, actually very like Galaxian. While flying through space, you awaken a swarm of deadly Firebirds which attack in swarms and move very quickly and erratically. The Firebirds come in 3 types. Gulls are the smallest but the easiest to kill, dying in 1 shot. Eagles are larger birds which take 2 shots to defeat. They also drop bombs which release shrapnel upon impact, so these are the best shot before that happens, but ensure that your ship is positioned directly below the blast to avoid the shrapnel. Emperors are the largest of the 3 birds and take a whopping 4 shots to kill. You shoot the birds with missiles which again look like little dicks, and I thought Nintendo was family friendly. Up to 4 missiles can be on the screen at any time, so you are limited to how much you can fire. Shooting the aforementioned Firebirds awards you 20, 50 and 100 points respectively, and a counter counts down from 50 as you do so. Once you've shot 50, it's on to the next stage. Firebirds shoot back at you too, so you need to avoid incoming fire as well as dodge their increasingly complex attack patterns. The only other form of attack or defence at your disposal is the warp mode, the use of which is limited to once per life. This makes your ship invincible, protected by a force field. You blast off up the screen, no longer constrained to the X-axis, taking out as many Firebirds as you can, as your shield is also deadly to them. This means that the strategic use of the warp mode has 2 main uses, to avoid certain death, or simply to take out a swarm of incoming enemies. If you manage to shoot all 50 birds before they hit the bottom of the screen, you are awarded a perfect 100 points. Getting these 100 point bonuses early on in the first couple of stages is essential to attain a decent score, as it becomes pretty damn hard to do once the birds are moving at pace. The sound isn't something to write home about, but in fairness it sounds infinitely better coming out of an original cab than it does on this emulation. The space sounds and shots do sound very 80s and quite cool in that retro arcade way. Space Firebird is another interesting title in Nintendo's brief arcade lineup, and one that's a fun little game despite being very similar to the previous year's Galaxian. Arm Wrestling was released in 1985 exclusively in North America. This was the final arcade game that Nintendo developed before outsourcing to third parties. A spin-off of Nintendo's popular Punch-Out series, Arm Wrestling was developed by the same team, Nintendo R&D 3. The cabinet featured twin monitors and a fun graphical style similar to Punch-Out, and had a very simple control scheme consisting of a joystick and 1 button. To play the game, the player moves the stick left and right to put pressure on the opponent's arm, or counter when the opponent is doing the same, with a button being pressed to increase power. To achieve your goal of becoming the World Arm Wrestling Champion, you'll take on 5 wacky opponents that are stylised in an over-the-top manner, much like those in Punch-Out. Texas Mac, a Texan cowboy complete with Stetson. Kabuki, a sumo wrestler similar in appearance to Street Fighter's E Honda. Mask X, a masked mystery man resembling a luchador wrestler. Ape 3, a robot monkey being controlled by a little girl called Alice via a joystick controller. And Frank Jr., a creature based on Frankenstein's monster. Once you've defeated all 5 opponents, the game loops, but the difficulty increases. There are 2 opportunities each loop where you can score points by catching a sack of money. This is achieved by pressing up on the joystick, but must be timed right. High scores are recorded not only for points scored, or in other words money earned, but for beating each opponent in the fastest time. Visually it looks quite striking for an arcade game at the time, although the sound effects are primitive, similar to those found on early 80s home computers. Interestingly, some of the announcers' phrases were sampled from the Bruce Lee film Enter the Dragon. Arm Wrestling is an interesting arcade game for fans of Punch-Out, or, considering that it was the last arcade game they developed, fans of Nintendo history. It's remained an arcade exclusive, although a clone called Arm Wrestle was released for the Spectrum. So those were 6 of Nintendo's small number of arcade only games. Let me know in the comments if you've played any and what you think of them. Thanks to my 2 guests Lee and Alex. Please head on over to check out their channels, Pug Hoof Gaming and Nintendo Arcade, which are both linked below, and I'll see you for another episode in the series soon. And as always, thanks for watching. You can check out the rest of the arcade exclusive series in this playlist.